So now I'm going to take that same method that I just showed and apply it to college football data. So why is this an interesting problem? Well, one, it's interesting if you like football, but it's also a really hard problem to solve. You have 128 teams in the FBS who only play 10 or so games a year, and the teams they do play, those teams also play most of the same teams, so there's little overlap in the teams that each school plays. And then, so out of those 10 or so games, you're trying to come up with the top 25. So this is something that people follow a lot, are the top 25 polls, and the playoff selection committee is coming up with their own rankings to determine the playoffs and championships. So it's an interesting problem of how do you do this? If you have so many variables, the teams never play each other, how do you compare them against each other? So what I did for the data was I'm using the AP top 25 poll as my ideal ranking. Now there are some issues with that because it is ranked by people, but it seems to be a consistent one that's used a lot, and it's the one that there's a lot of data on, so I could look back last year and see what the poll was this week in 2013. So that's what I used as my training data, was looked at the poll through this week last year, and then my testing data is the poll this week as of Monday. So the features that I'm using, I have all kinds of stats for offensive, defensive, so points scored, points against, total average yards for and against, penalty yards, turnovers, and there's a lot more, but I just had to narrow it down to some that I thought would be useful. What conference they belong to, that should probably be important, because that'll determine probably their strength of schedule. Their win percentage will play a big role, and then I'm trying to incorporate strength of schedule as best I can, so I tried to put in wins and losses against other ranked teams. Because I'm only looking at 2 teams at a time, I can't consider the whole rankings or the whole set of teams and the structure between them. So if there's 2 teams that both played the same team, how do they do against that team? I can't really incorporate that into the model that well. And I also cheated a little bit. I'm only looking at the top 25 teams. So instead of all 128, I first narrow it down to 25, and then I rank those teams. So this is something that Google probably does anyways. They're probably not running these algorithms on millions of results. They're probably narrowing it down to a smaller subset and then ranking that subset. Right. So let's see how the ranking SVM method worked out. So in this first column here, you'll see the true ranking, and it's continued over here. And then next to it is the predicted. So the first one right, Mississippi State. 2 and 3, Florida State and Oregon, are flipped. And then you can see there's some rearrangements as you go down the list, but a lot of them are pretty close. Some are pretty far off, so Marshall would be ranked 5th. So they're a team that has they're undefeated, but they're in a much easier conference. So it's probably weighting win percentage too much here. So it seems to be working well, but is that really that good? We already narrowed it down to the 25. We knew who was going to be in there. Probably shouldn't be that hard to do. So we want to compare it to some baseline of, what's the worst we could do. So I'll take the naive approach and just use regression to fit this data. And you can see the first 2 rankings are perfectly right, Mississippi State, Florida State. There's some rearrangements as you go down as well, just like the other one. So how do these 2 compare against each other? If you look at Kendall's Tau, they're almost identical. So for this problem, if you take the naive approach and use regression, not only will your mother still love you, she'd probably be quite proud that it actually does just as well as this fancy method that we've been talking about. So why didn't it work this well? Well, neither method used the group structure of the data. So we're narrowing it down. With regression, we're looking at 1 team at a time. With SVM, we're looking at 2 teams at a time, so we're ignoring all the other teams they play against. Whereas some of the other probability models, like Bradley Terry, will naturally incorporate the strength of schedule into that model. And then also, ranking SVM was one of the first machine learning methods used for ranking. There's tons of others that have come out since using more advanced ranking methods and machine learning techniques, and some that use the whole group structure of the data instead of just looking at pairwise or pointwise observations. I think when this first came out in 2002, he showed in an experiment that it did better than Google, but a lot's changed in the last decade, so it's probably not the best one to use for this. And that's all I have. Do you guys have any questions? Yes.
What are some of, so you said ranking SVM has been improved upon, right? So what are the hot SVM
So
rankers?
one I came across was SVM map, so mean average precision, and that one is supposed to incorporate the whole group structure of your observations, but I think it's only comparing relevance and irrelevance. I don't know if it's actually doing rankings. I didn't have time to explore that, but a lot of these others that I talked about at the beginning that use neural networks or boosting or ensemble methods, those are doing the same thing, but are usually performing a lot better. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for learning to rank, it gives you a whole list of a lot of the algorithms that have come out, and this one was one of the first.
When was that, you know?
2002, I think. So a lot of these are fairly new. And there's not a whole lot outside of the machine learning community regarding this stuff. So the two branches I talked about in the beginning, there's not a whole lot of overlap in the literature between the two different approaches. So I had to do a lot of searching around to try to combine all of those models together. And there's no really good resources in statistics, at least, that talk about methods for ranking or ranking models.
More so just an application of football. I was just curious, do they have direct and easy ways to sort of do like a model averaging on the ranking information? Just thinking like you have multiple polls, you rank on all polls and then do some type of model averaging on that.
Yeah, so that's
maybe that's actually as simple as literally you had the slide with the coefficients that you're applying with a theoretical zero. Maybe it's as simple as, I guess, model averaging a linear model of multiple linear models. But yeah, I was just kind of curious if that's something people talk about a lot, especially when you rank. I imagine there's different criteria that's popular.
Yeah, that's actually a big topic in machine learning. It's called rank aggregation, where they take lots of different rankings and aggregating them to the best ranking. Instead of what I'm doing here, where I have one ranking and some features that I'm trying to learn about and model.
Did you data scrape to get your football data?
Yeah, it took a lot of cleaning to get it in the format I wanted. It was pretty easily available from sportsreference.com, but I did have to clean it up a lot to put it in a useful form. And there's probably a lot more out there that I just didn't have time to incorporate, and I wanted to try to keep it simple. But it seems like other models that incorporate the strength of schedule that might include all teams, like a Bradley Terry model or something similar to that, would probably be more useful for something like this.
So, what made you interested in ranking things? Was it just Dr. Joe's class, or?
No, I started working with Dr. Bondell, and we're looking at ranking problems right now, so I had to read up on a lot of this and saw SVM was used for some things.
So do you know what you're going to be doing?
Not really.
Okay.
It's more on the probability side, so extensions of Plackett-Luce, which is a multivariate Bradley Terry model, and trying to incorporate features into modeling rankings where you have infinite observations or infinite items that you could rank. I think is the direction we're going.
Can you give a quick overview of what the Bradley Terry model is?
Sure. So you have, say, theta I. So you have theta I is 1 through n, so these would be 1 through 128. You'd have 128 parameters for each of these. And then between any two teams, theta I and theta j, these parameters is the probability that I would beat j. So the likelihood would just be the product of all the teams that play each other where I beat j. And then you could use MLE to find theta. You could use Bayesian methods, which would probably work better. And then the thetas would be like a performance parameter. So larger values of theta means it's a better team. They're more likely to beat a team with a smaller theta. And then once you estimate all these thetas, you could just rank them. And this is nice because it'll naturally incorporate the strength of schedule, because wins against weak teams won't change theta as much as wins against more powerful teams.
Have you tried that in your data?
Not yet.
Is that
Not yet.
A lot of Wisconsin.
Nick and I are doing a similar problem for our Bayesian project, and we just ran it real quick, and it's very similar to this, and it seemed to work really well. Maybe only a few of the rankings were off. And then you don't have to include covariates at all. All you need are the win-loss data for each game to do something like that.
Okay. Now what if I wanted to take that and also incorporate margin of victory?
You can do that. So you just add an extra parameter, and that would account for that, or you could have home field advantage parameters.
This is cool because this is something I never, outside
Cool.
of ordinal modeling, never really,
It's very hard to.
we don't get much exposure to these ranking type approaches.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to find stuff in statistics books or statistic literature. A lot of it's either econometrics or computer science. All right. Thank you.